So, part 3 of IGCSE Weather, Climate, and Ecosystems. Deserts. The distribution of deserts. Deserts are located near the tropics, so Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. Well, Capricorn. Pronounce it like you want to, I don't know. Some of the world's most famous deserts include the Sahara Desert in northern Africa, the Atacama, in South America, the Kalahari in southern Africa, the Gobi Desert in Central Asia, the Arabian Desert in the Middle East, the Great Victoria and Great Sandy in Australia, the Mojave and Chihuahuan of North America. But you don't need to know these by these names, you just kind of need to know they exist. Just know that there are deserts all over the world. Antarctica is sometimes classified as a desert because it actually has very low levels of precipitation. However, when we talk about deserts in this section of the desert, we mean sandy deserts, so don't get confused. Desert climates. Deserts are extremely dry or arid places. True deserts normally have less than 250 millimeters a year, although some deserts, like the Atacama to the right, well, I removed the picture, so not to the right, but like the Atacama can go years without any water. Deserts are very dry because the air that descends over them is very dry. The air is dry because most of the moisture has fallen as precipitation over the equator, so where the tropical rainforests are, before being pushed out and falling near the tropics. The air is also very dry because the air traveling from the equator to the tropics travels over land and not the sea. This means that no additional moisture is picked up. Because there is no moisture in the air, there are very few clouds in deserts, which means desert areas are exposed to high levels of incoming radiation from the sun. This means that daytime temperatures in the desert are very, very high. And however, the lack of cloud cover also means that a lot of outgoing radiation is able to escape, making desert temperatures very, very cold at night. So even though the annual temperature range in deserts is very low, the daily temperature range is very, very high because it can go from like 40 degrees Celsius to like 10 degrees Celsius. So the daily temperature range is known as the diurnal temperature range. Diurnal is kind of the geographical word for daily. So desert fauna and flora. Because of the very arid, dry, I'm going to stop saying dry every time I say arid now. You should know by now that arid means dry. So because of the very arid conditions found in deserts, both plants and animals have had to adapt to survive. Adaptations may include the succulents like cacti, which is the plural of cactus. Succulents tend to be fairly fat, fleshy plants that are able to store water in their leaves, trunks, and roots. Ephemeral. These are plants with very short life cycles, typically 6 to 8 weeks. This means that they can take advantage of very short wet seasons in order to pollinate. Long and wide roots. Plants in deserts have very, very long roots so that they are able to absorb the maximum amount of rainfall during periods of rainfall. It also makes them more stable in very loose soil. Spiky and waxy surfaces. Many plants, like cacti, protect themselves with spikes and waxes so that they are not eaten or damaged by animals. Deserts also don't have the same variety of animals as tropical rainforests, but many insects, reptiles, and mammals have adapted to survive. For instance, camels. Camels store fatty tissue in their humps, which when metabolized actually releases water, as well as fat, enabling them to survive in water. Nocturnal animals. Many animals will hide in burrows or behind rocks and vegetation during the hot daylight hours and only emerge at night. Then they don't overheat shit. Even though deserts are very hot, arid environments that normally have very low population densities, humans can still threaten them. Some of the threats are caused by humans, and these may include extraction of resources, for instance, if you want to take copper from a desert. Hunting, for instance, animals that live in deserts. For instance, if you want to hunt cheetahs to make a rug or something. Tourists damaging dunes. So, if there are dunes bordering a desert or something and tourists damage them, well, it's not good. overgrazing, which will kill what little vegetation there is, and even overcultivation, so too much farming or too many animals living on the place and grazing the little vegetation because there's not a lot anyway, and all the animals eating it reduces it to pretty much nothing. Deforestation. There is limited, well, extremely limited vegetation in deserts, but often what is there is removed for fuel or to make space for crops. Toyotarization. This is when 4x4 vehicles, so just, large vehicles, are being driven across the desert. Well, it disturbs animals, killing vegetation, and creates dust storms. What is desertification? Well, it's the process of a land turning into a desert. And land degradation, like we've said just about a bazillion times, is the reduction in the quality and quantity of the soil. So, what are some human causes of desertification? Well, you've got overgrazing, allowing too much livestock to graze on a piece of land, which means that all their vegetation is eaten, and this will make the ground susceptible to wind and water erosion. Overcultivation. If you farm land too intensively and don't have fallow periods, then all the nutrients in the soil get used. So you've overcultivated the land and can no longer, have crops or anything. Deforestation. Cutting down trees, which not only means the land will be receiving less nutrients, but also means it's more vulnerable to erosion, because there is no interception and less stability because the root systems have been removed. So there may also be an increased likelihood of landslides. Overpopulation. As the world population continues to grow, it's now at about 7 billion, the demand for agricultural products like crops and meat is increasing, causing more land to be deforested, overcultivated, and overgrazed. So, yeah. Fertilizer and pesticide use. By using fertilizers and pesticides, you can artificially increase yields of crops. However, the process is unnatural, and prolonged periods of use can result in, the use can result in all the naturally produced nutrients can be used up, and local water sources may become polluted, which will reduce the ability of the land to cultivate crops, and therefore make it vulnerable to chemical degradation and then eventually wind and water erosion. High-yield variety and genetically modified crops. Like with fertilizers and pesticides, it is argued that high-yield variety and genetically modified crops have encouraged overcultivation, diminishing natural nutrients in the soil. Unsustainable water use. Well, if aquifers, which are rocks that hold water, or rivers are used unsustainably, then areas can become increasingly arid, as water resources are used up. A classic example of unsustainable irrigation happens in the Aral Sea. Toyotarization. This is basically the increased use of cars to travel across grasslands, deserts, etc., which will damage the topsoil and increase wind and water erosion, as well as creating sandstorms if you're in a really sandy desert. What are some physical causes of desertification? Well, rising temperature. As global temperatures increase, it is becoming increasingly hard for vegetation to grow, thus reducing vegetation cover and increasing the risk of wind and water erosion. Falling rainfall. As the amount of rainfall is reduced in some areas, like the Sahel, then it is increasingly hard for vegetation to grow again, making the ground more vulnerable to wind and water erosion. Flash floods. Intense periods of rainfall can also cause erosion of topsoil, which leads to land degradation. Also, wind. If a region is particularly windy, then the amount of wind erosion is likely to increase. What are some problems of desertification? Well, dust storms. As soil becomes less stable because of the lack of vegetation, it becomes much more vulnerable to wind erosion, which can create large-scale dust storms. Northern China is suffering from an increased frequency of dust storms as desertification takes place south of the Gobi Desert. Another problem of desertification would be reduced crop yields. As the soil becomes less fertile, the amount of crops that it can support will be reduced. So the falling crop yields can lead to famine and even starvation. Conflict. With increasing soil degradation and the reduction in agricultural output and available agricultural land, well, conflict can arise over the diminishing resources since there is more people that want it than there is, the actual resource. So people will argue over it. This can lead to conflict. Famine. If the soil become degraded, so if they undergo degradation, well, and crops begin to fail or the yields are reduced in quantity, and then, there's famine. Famine is normally caused by a combination of factors like soil degradation, drought, and possibly a natural disaster or conflict. So if soil undergoes degradation, it increases the potential of famine. What are some solutions to desertification? Well, crop rotation and fallow periods. Growing different crops each year, so different nutrients are used, and allowing periods of rest, also known as fallow periods, is good because it means that soil can regain its fertility. Shelter belts. They are often, sometimes called windbreaks. What they are, they're areas of forest or hedge that are left untouched to protect farmland from the effects, not affects, of water and wind erosion. Shelter belts will often appear around the outside of fields. So think of it as, say you're in the middle of the forest, you have like an empty square with no trees, and there you have your crops, but it's surrounded by trees so that, the wind doesn't really destroy your shit. Reforestation and afforestation. By reforesting or afforesting areas, you can help return land to its natural state, making it more fertile and stable, thus reducing wind and water erosion and ultimately land degradation. Irrigation. It is possible to water areas of land that have become arid to try and improve the productivity of the soil. However, if water is not used sustainably, then irrigation can cause water shortages and land degradation elsewhere. Grazing quotas. Placing limits on the number and types of animals that can graze on land will reduce the destruction of vegetation and eventual desertification. Population control. The main reason we are putting more pressure on the Earth's resources, including soil, is because the world's population has reached 7 billion and is still growing rapidly. If we can control the population growth, then we can limit the amount of agricultural land we need and the intensity of our farming. GM crops. GM stands for genetically modified. GM crops can be engineered to withstand poor soil and water shortages. By growing some types of vegetation, you may be able to add nutrients back to the soil. However, it might encourage people to farm on unsuitable land, causing even further land degradation. So, tropical storms. Tropical storms take different names in different parts of the world. In the Caribbean, US, and Central America, they are known as hurricanes. In the Indian Ocean, they are known as cyclones, and in the Pacific, around the Philippines and Indonesia, they are known as typhoons. Tropical storms are normally found between the tropics near the equator. The formation of tropical storms is not fully known, but scientists do know that they draw their energy from warm seas. Therefore, tropical storms tend to happen in late summer, when temperatures are the warmest, so over 27 degrees Celsius. Because tropical storms get their energy from the sea, when they do hit land, they do lose their energy fairly quickly. Most tropical storms last between 1 and 2 weeks. The main hazards caused by tropical storms are, winds. Very, very strong winds, up to 250 kilometers per hour, accompany tropical storms. Strong winds can damage buildings, knock over trees, and disrupt transport and communications. Flooding. Heavy rainfall is associated with tropical storms. Heavy rainfall actually causes much more damage and death than high winds. Storm surges. Tropical storms moving inland can create storm surges and big waves. If tropical storms coincide with spring tides, the impacts can be severe. Landslides. Landslides are a secondary hazard. They can be triggered when large amounts of rainfall saturate the ground, increasing the stress on the slope. So tropical storms are measured on the Saffir-Simpson scale. It currently has 5 categories, although some meteorologists believe a 6th category should be introduced to describe super hurricanes. Storms below 74 miles per hour are described as only tropical storms. Anything above this speed is officially a hurricane, cyclone, or typhoon. Done.